Okay, in this video, we're going to understand how inflation affects interest rates. And interest rates are set in the financial system or the market for loanable funds. So we need to understand how inflation affects these interest rates. So how inflation, which we said is Greek letter pi, affects interest rates. Okay, so imagine the scenario that we have this scenario. Let's say the iPhone 6 is going to come out. Okay, so iPhone 6 comes out, and both my friend and I are waiting in line. Okay, so let's say that a new iPhone 6, so this is today, an iPhone 6. Actually, I would never buy an iPhone 6. I would buy an Android phone. But we'll just say it's an iPhone 6. So we have an iPhone 6, and it costs, we'll just say it costs $400. Let's say $200. So an iPhone 6 costs $200 today, and my friend and I are waiting in line. However, my friend doesn't have the money for an iPhone 6. So today we both want the iPhone 6. Okay. However, I have the money for it and am ready to buy it. My friend is waiting in line just hoping he'll get lucky and somehow get $200 to buy his iPhone 6. Okay, so we're waiting in line, and my friend says to me, you know what? If I get paid next week. So if you can hold off buying an iPhone 6 for 1 week, and if you lend me your $200 today, I'll pay you back 5% on top of the $200 next week. Okay, so here's me with $200 ready to buy the iPhone 6, and I think about it and I go, I can do without an iPhone 6 for 1 week. So I lend him the $200, he goes and buys the iPhone 6. Okay? So now, and the deal of the contract is he pays interest rates, small I, equal to 5% in 1 week. So overall, he would pay $200 plus 5%, which is $10 more. So he's going to repay overall $210 in 1 week. Now let's fast forward 1 week. So now 1 week later, I get my $200 back. So this $210 plus interest comes back to me. And now I have $210 in hand. Okay, so I made 5% interest, so I'm pretty happy. I waited 1 week and I got 5% interest. That beats any market that I could have bought, that I could have invested in. So I have my $10 more on top of my $200, and I go back and I go to the Apple store, and I'm at the Apple store, and what do I find? The iPhone 6 is very, very popular. And in fact, instead of costing $200, which I thought it would, it now costs $220. So we had, in this 1 week time period, the iPhone 6 underwent inflation. Okay? At the same time, my initial $200 turned into $210 because of the interest rate. So my $200 that I lended out turned into $210. However, the iPhone underwent inflation. So here's what happened. I'm not very happy with this deal because I get repaid and I'm still $10 short of an iPhone. even though the day that I lended my money out, I could have bought an iPhone because I gave up $200. So I gave up $200, which I was going to buy an iPhone with, and now I get paid back with interest, and I still have to toss in an additional $10 on top of my money plus interest to buy my iPhone. So what we really care about is not the interest rate itself. Interest rate 5% seemed like a good deal. However, we don't care about the money. So the nominal interest rate tells us how much we pay back in terms of dollar amounts. 5% on a $200 loan tells me that I have to pay back $10 interest. That's a dollar amount. I don't care about the money. What I care about is what I can buy with that money. Okay, so we have to convert dollars into goods and services, which we do so when we look at goods and services, they undergo inflation. So if the prices of goods and services change over the time that I don't have my money or that my interest is accruing, we can see that bad things happen. So in this case, my buddy's really happy. And in this case, I'm really upset by the deal. Okay, so even though it seemed like I was making a good deal at the time with 5% interest, because the iPhone underwent inflation at a faster rate than my interest accrued, I'm worse off as a result. Okay, so what do we mean? So here we have the nominal interest rate, which is small I. And the nominal interest rate is the dollar amount that we pay back. So it's interest expressed in goods and services. However, what we care about is how much I actually have to pay back in goods and services. Oh, excuse me, this is expressed in dollars, not goods and services. Anything that's expressed in current dollars is what we call nominal. What I care about is the real interest rate, which we denote small r. So small I is a nominal interest rate. Real interest rate is small r. And this is going to be expressed in goods and services. Okay, let's go back to our iPhone example, and we can see how we can use inflation to convert nominal interest rates into real interest rates. Okay, so here we know that our nominal interest rate was equal to 5% in that example. So my friend, I loaned my friend $200. He paid me back 5%, so I got $210 back in a week. Inflation, which is equal to the percentage change of prices. So our iPhone went from $200 to $220, so 220 minus 200 divided by 200 multiplied by 100, percentage change formula, is equal to 10%. Okay? So I got paid 5% interest, but prices went up by 10% over that time frame. Okay? And what do we know? The last component is how much worse off am I as a result of the loan? So here, we knew that I had $200 and I got $210 back, but the iPhone cost $220, so I was $10 short. So out of my original $200, I was $10 out of my original $200 short, minus 10 here, and we'll multiply this by 100, and that tells me that I was minus 5% what I needed to buy an iPhone. So I lost 5% on the deal, right? Because I had to throw in an additional $10. So this is going to be the real interest rate. So what we need to do is, how do we find the real interest rate using these two numbers? And as you can probably see, if we take 5% minus 10%, that gets us minus 5%. Okay, so what we see is that the real interest rate is going to be approximately equal to, when interest and inflation are small, 10% or less, the real interest rate is going to be equivalent to the nominal interest rate minus inflation. So here, 5% interest that my friend paid me in dollars, but goods and services cost 20% or 10% more, excuse me. So overall, I lost 5% on the deal in terms of goods or services. Or I had to pay an additional 5% on the iPhone of my original money. So minus 5. 5 minus 10 gives me a minus 5 here. Okay, so this is what we actually care about, because this is what we're going to use that money for, is to buy goods and services. So the prices of goods and services matter. Now imagine that you're taking out a mortgage on a house. Well, you pay off that mortgage after 30 years. So obviously you would not expect the prices today to be equivalent to what they are 30 years from now. Okay, so inflation plays a larger role the longer our loan is contracted for. So if we have a very long loan, inflation is going to play a more important role than if it is in the short term. Okay, so by tomorrow, I don't expect the price of iPhones to go up or the prices of food to go up too much by tomorrow. So inflation is very small, and the nominal interest rate is going to be equivalent or very close to the real interest rate, since inflation is very small in the short term. But over the long term, inflation can be very high, so there's a big gap between these two things. Okay, the last thing that we need to know is, this isn't really that big of a deal, because if I know inflation is going to be 10%, I would have never loaned my friend the money at 5%. I would have said, well, you're going to have to pay me 15%. So in that case, I would have got paid 15% minus the inflation, which was 10%. I would have been 5% better off. Okay, so in that case, I would have been happy. So if I know what inflation is, that's no problem, because I just adjust my nominal interest rate, so I get the appropriate real interest rate that will make me lend. However, the problem happens is, I don't know what inflation is going to be over the next year, or the next 2 years, or the next 20 years. So I don't know what this is. So I have to go in with an expected inflation rate. Okay, so here, this is what we actually pay. In terms of goods and services, is what we call the ex post real interest rate. After the fact, after we know what inflation is, I can tell you exactly how much I paid in terms of goods and services. So that's my ex post real interest rate. Okay? What we think we're going to pay when we set up the loan, because I have to decide whether to lend my money today and then get paid back in 6 months, which I don't know what inflation is going to be over the next 6 months. I have to make that decision today. So I have some thinking to do, and I think I'm going to pay what we call the expected real interest rate, or this is going to be the ex ante real interest rate. Okay, so the ex ante means before the fact. So here, it's the nominal interest rate, which we agreed upon. In this case, it was 5%, minus what I think inflation is going to be, E for expectations. So in the iPhone example, obviously you were thinking that the iPhone wouldn't change price. So in this case, you were expecting inflation to be 0. Interest rate was 5%, or the nominal interest rate was 5%. So I was expecting a 5% real return on my money. However, because expected inflation didn't equal actual inflation, these two things are different. Or what I think I'm going to pay when I lend out the money isn't equal to what I actually pay when I receive that money back, or when I'm borrowing or lending. Okay? And here the problem is that inflation was higher than expected, and my friend who borrowed the money was happy, and I, the lender, was not very happy. So if inflation is higher than expected, it's bad for lenders because they're not making as high real interest rate as they expected to make. Okay, so in this case, if we have three scenarios, if inflation is bigger than expected inflation, that implies that the real interest rate, the ex post real interest rate, is less than the ex ante, the expected real interest rate. And that's bad for lenders, good for borrowers. Sorry, that's a little small. Okay. The next scenario is, what happens if I expected 10% inflation and inflation turned out to be 0? So here I would have said, okay, I'm going to have to set a nominal interest rate of 15% if I think that inflation is going to be 10% for the iPhone. So for me to lend, I have to have a higher interest rate. So here I have 15 minus what I think is going to be 10%. So I'm expecting to receive 5% on my money. What happens if the iPhone didn't change price? 15 minus 0 means that I'm actually receiving 15% back, which I'm really happy as a lender, but my friend who's the borrower is really upset that he was paying 15% because he was only expecting to pay 5% in real terms. So our other scenario is that if inflation is less than expected, that implies that ex post real interest rate, what we actually pay, is going to be bigger than what we thought we were going to pay. And if you're the payer, you don't want to pay higher than you expected. So this is bad for the borrower, good for the lender. So good for a lender, bad for a borrower. And then the last scenario is, what happens if inflation meets our expectations? Then in this case, these two things are equivalent. These two things equal if actual inflation equals expected inflation. And then in that scenario, we both know we're going to be better off because we both went in thinking we're going to pay this, and if I wasn't happy with it as a lender, I would have said I'm not lending the money. And if my friend the borrower wasn't happy with thinking of paying this, he wouldn't have borrowed the money. Okay? So in this case, if everything equals what we thought it was going to be, and these two things equal out, then both parties are better off as a result. So it doesn't hurt neither the borrower or the lender, and we're not better off in unexpected ways. So the problem isn't inflation itself, because if we know what inflation is going to be, we'll adjust the nominal interest rate such that we get a real interest rate that both the borrower and the lender are happy paying. The problem comes when inflation doesn't meet our expectations, or we have unanticipated inflation or deflation. Then we see how it can be bad for lenders or good for lenders, and vice versa for the borrowers. Okay, so overall, inflation plays a very important role in when we look at interest rates, because interest rates are deferred payment. And if we're going to use those payments to buy goods and services, then we're deferring our goods and services that we're buying, and over that time frame, prices can creep up or down. So inflation plays an important role in when we look at interest rates. So again, nominal interest rate is the stated interest rate on a loan. It's expressed in dollars. It tells you how many dollars that you have to pay back for a loan. The real interest rate is expressed in goods and services. It tells me how many goods and services I have to forfeit to borrow money or to lend money. Okay, so overall, we can take our nominal interest rate, subtract off inflation, and it will give us our real interest rate in return.